Right. Welcome to another episode of Embracing Differences with me, Nibin Anand. Um, Today I have with me John Flach. John, nice to have you. And would you like to give a little introduction about yourself?
Uh, yeah, so my background is in psychology, and most of my career has been, up, I would say, in the field of applied psychology, applied cognitive psychology, human factors, social technical systems, and uh, I'm my primary interest is figuring out how experts are able to do things that are beyond the capacity of mere humans.
Can you unpack that a little bit, John?
Yeah, so much of my work is going into domains and trying to understand how it is that people do what they do. And so my early work was actually in the aviation domain, and uh, I was inspired a lot by Gibson's work on optical flow fields, and I was very interested in how pilots use information, how they knew whether they were on the right glide slope, and what were the things that underlie. So my early work was a lot on perceptual motor skills, and one place that was a rich place to study perceptual motor skills was in aviation because of flight simulators. So and my at the beginning of my career, graphical computing was just beginning to scan up, and so we for the first time had the opportunity to actually simulate interactive interactions between a person and flow fields that we could create in the visual displays of flight simulators. And so for the first time, we actually had the technology to actually test some of Gibson's hypothesis about optic flow. So
And
that's sort of
and
where I started,
sure. And in the
and
context of sorry, in the context of what we are discussing, which is how do experts know what they know? How does that fit in within this discussion, John?
well, I guess so. It to a certain extent, it was motivated by uh, my own probably inadequacies in sports and music and other things, and I always felt like the experts knew something that I didn't know. There was some secret, some trick that they had, and I wanted to figure it out. And um, I think one of the things that I've learned over the years is it's 90% practice, practice, practice. It's not a trick in the head, but it's something. And I guess in along with the theme of your book, and the learning is not like some mental trick. It's really embodied, and so you've got to engage. You got to engage fully with a domain, or with an instrument in music, but in a sport, and you got to do the drills. You got to do the hard work to be able to see the world the way the experts do.
Yes, that's so true. And you wanted to talk about fallibility, John, and you want to talk about the book. Where would you like to begin? What is it that you have in mind? Maybe we can explore some topics for discussion.
Well, I think the things that stood out to me in the book was your own story about your near miss, as well as uh, you know the the Costa Concordia captain, Francesco. And I really felt that he got a raw deal, and had a I guess had a sense of injustice that in his being sent to prison for just being what it came down to, is being a human.
And that's right. Yes. 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 So, is there anything in particular that you would like to explore in the discussion today?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess, in reading about their stories, your story and Francesco's story, it made me more mindful of my own history and the places where I failed. And one of the things that, so in my career, I was right out of graduate school. I got a very plum academic position at University of Illinois, and was somewhat full of myself. It was really one of the top programs in the country, and to get an faculty position there right out of graduate school was I was very proud of that. But I ended up not getting tenure there, and not getting tenure there was a point where I felt like my career was over. And there was, on the one hand, in your book, when you talk about your own experience and the loss of confidence and trust of your colleagues on the ship, and how you felt judged by them, and I felt some of that, but I also reflect back, and first of all, it wasn't fatal, so my career didn't end with not getting tenure. But I think, and sometimes I think, having an early failure kind of inoculates you against future failures and makes it easier to come. But the more I thought about it, and kind of a new insight when I thought about it, is the inoculation, I think, is largely not due to the failure itself, but to the kindness of other people on the other side of the failure. So, for me, you realize, who your friends are, for example. So some people, treat you as a failure, and other people say, hey, you're a good person, we still believe in you, and, there's your family. But also, for me, there were a couple people who I think went out of their way to be kind to me after the accident, and build up my confidence and let me know that they thought that my work was valuable and things. And in particular, Jens Rasmussen, but also, Chris Wickens, who was the person who hired me at Illinois. I feel both of them went out of their way to say, hey, it's not you, it's circumstances. And also they opened the door to other opportunities that, were an advocate for me to help other opportunities and other doors open. So I think, that gets back to the learning from failure, I think, is not purely a cognitive thing, but the thing that enables learning from failure is the kindness of people who can accept you and your fallibilities. And those, you're lucky if you have those people in your life.
What a fascinating discussion we started off with, John, because what you are discussing now is really something that I find is missing in the discourse today around resilience, which is the social aspect of resilience. That I think Gabor Mate and Professor, I have this book, Bessel van den Kolk, talk about the idea of distress and trauma that comes from failing in the society, and a lot of it, as you very rightly pointed out, is not the failure itself, but the realization through relationships, through the social relationships, that you're made to believe that you did something that was a failure. So the failure is basically something socially imposed upon you. I think that's a very important thing to understand. And from there, if there are people who will embrace your fallibility, I think the recovery from that failure is remarkably different from if you're left on your own. In fact, one of the most beautiful sentences that Professor Bessel van der Kolk uses is that we have been. I'd be interested to explore what you think, given where you come from, the society, individualist kind of society where you live in, and I think I face some of that also. But I grew up in India, and we never had this concept of antidepressants and all sort of psychotherapy and other kind of help. Help was in the culture. When you face a difficult situation, you go and have a conversation with somebody. They will listen. They will give you advice. But I found that always missing when I first moved to this world. It's a lot. A lot of it is left to you and your own. And I think this whole idea of putting on a performance show every day as we go to work, more so in today's world, and not succeeding all the time, which is very natural, falls back upon you, and you have to have that coping mechanism. So I think the whole idea of resilience is centered around the individual. Very little discussion around the idea of social resilience, that we live in a society. And I think that discourse is, I find, somehow missing in the resilience literature also. What are your views, John?
So another theme in my work is the closed loop coupling, and I think you're right, is that it's our self-image, our confidence, our belief in ourselves is largely, I think, constructed by the reflection that we see in other people. That is, it's a feedback, and again, I think my, if we call it resilience, my resilience in the face of not getting tenure, I think is largely attributed not so much to any to me internally, but rather to the network that I had and the people who were able to, and again, and I don't think in terms of infallibility, but who were able to help me to appreciate the value that I still had, the abilities, and shifted my focus from the failure, the loss, or the inadequacies to the potential value that I still had to contribute.
And that's interesting because for two things. But first, I heard you using the word kindness a lot. You use the word kindness quite a lot as you were talking just now. So maybe we should explore why would you call it kindness? Why do you see it that way? What is kindness to you?
Well, I mean, my feeling is that that people like Jens Rasmussen actually went out of the way to to open doors for me and to validate and tell me, to help me feel, like I had something to contribute to, that what I was doing was valuable, and part of it saying, they just don't understand, what you're saying is it's too far outside of the box for them to understand, but you're going in the right direction, he didn't have, he didn't have to, So, I met him because he came to Illinois because to see other people, but but after I left Illinois, he made trips to the new school where I was and visited there. Which wasn't a big, you know, which which really was kind of enhanced my status in the new place and and again it's kind of he welcomed me into within his halo and I got a opportunity, so I wasn't I was not defined by the experience at Illinois, but the relationship with Jens and with other people just kind of compensated. Again, it just balanced things out.
Oh, absolutely, John.
And I think without that extra effort that he put in, I think things could have easily tipped in a less positive direction. For me, anyway.
And have you reflected on this any more deeper than what you just described, John? That why would somebody show that kindness to you in those dark moments? What is it that, in the grand scheme of things, what does that tell you about yourself, about the other person, and the relationship between you? Have you reflected upon that?
Yeah, since I'm talking about it, obviously I have. I'm not sure how to put it in words. I think that it, for me, I guess it says a lot more about the people who are smart enough and kind enough to make that extra effort than it says about me, who was more on the receiving end. I think the other thing I reflect on is, are there opportunities where I could have put in more effort to help other people through their struggling times? And I can reflect back on situations where I think I could have been more kind than I was.
Yes. And I think the idea of kindness actually comes from seeing the other person as a whole person. And what I mean by that is, if you look at the Greek mythology, for example, the symbol of wisdom is associated with both Athena and the bird owl. And one of the reasons why owl is considered a symbol of wisdom is that the owl has the ability to turn around and see things from a wider perspective. So almost about 270 degrees or so. In the HR jargon these days, we have this whole idea of 360 degrees review. And in the Indian mythology, I'll just show you something here. We have this demon, which has 10 heads, and this is called Ravana. And the point I'm trying to make is this, that and these images have existed through time immemorial, actually, this kind of archetypes, and we can talk about that. But what I'm trying to say is that in understanding John, I am not only focused on what he did or didn't do as a result of which he failed. I also see him. I also see some of his successes. I also approach him as a father, as a brother, as a sibling, as a successful professor, as a very successful colleague, as somebody who has written or published something that interests me. So I take a more holistic view of that person. So I see that John as a whole person. And I think when you start to see another person as a whole person and don't reduce them to one particular behavior, I think you see the beauty in that person and you see a connection with that person, which doesn't happen very often when you get sucked into this narrative of behaviorism, simplifying someone's behavior to one particular trait, and particularly the one that we don't like, And why we don't like it is because we see something in ourselves that we have not really accepted, so we project it onto other people. So I call somebody lazy because I am lazy, and I project it on other people without realizing that I am lazy. And I think we fail to make that 360-degree review, as we call it, in other people, seeing the whole person. I find that quite a lot, John, and I think it's got something to do with this whole idea of simplifying somebody to one particular trait or behavior.
Yeah, I agree.
And I think so if we go back to the book, which is what we were discussing, and the idea of embracing fallibility, I think a lot of it comes when an accident happens, when something goes wrong. The first thing is to go into the judgmental mode and start to simplify things in order to make sense of it, that somebody must have screwed it up. But if you take a step back and start to go a little bit deeper, you will find connection with people, because at the end of the day, we are all humans, and there has to be some link between all of us at a very fundamental level. And I think once you start to realize that link, in which my case it was that, here's somebody who's involved in an accident, just like me, I was involved in an accident, you start to see the parallels, and things start to make sense from there. And hence the idea of embracing fallibility. And I think what it does is, in some ways, it helps you to forgive your own self for all the things that you did, forgive the other person for what they did. And I think there's a lot of learning in forgiveness. And you use the word kindness. I think there's a lot of learning in that kindness. Yes.
Yeah, and I mean, you're bringing in your experiences, crossing cultures, and I think that's part of the experience that helps you to be kind, for me, when I was growing up, my family moved around a lot, so we weren't crossing cultures, but we were moving around primarily in the U.S. and well, I mean, U.S. is fairly cultural diverse, more than a lot of people think. But I was born in Baltimore, and we moved to the Chicago area, and then to West Virginia, which was a very different culture than what I experienced in Baltimore and Chicago, and then to Dayton. But I think there's kind of a skill in being the new kid in the room, and you don't have that confidence of knowing the rules, and so you have to, I don't know. In my experience is, you have to accept be in the background and observe carefully, so you don't cross the rules that you haven't learned yet. And so I think that experience of being the new kid over and over again, and then the experience of going into other people's domains, so not being a pilot but getting into the simulator with pilots, or going into the nuclear power plant and observing operators there, or in the military, observing command and control situations, stuff where you're an outsider. I think you learn to deal with surprise, and you learn to prepare to deal with surprises and pick up the surprises, which I think is really important. Part of, I guess the other word that I think goes along very closely with kindness is humility. But the luxury of knowing that you don't know everything and you still have a lot to learn. And Jens used to always, one of the things that he used to always say is, whenever you go into a new domain, many of the behaviors will seem irrational, but they're only irrational because there are constraints in that domain that you aren't aware of, but the people in the domain are very salient to the people in the domain. And the more time you spend in the domain, the more sensitive you'll become to those constraints. And I think in the Costa Concordia accident, I mean, the what struck me is the exchange between the captain when he was outside the ship and on the radio, and the other guy, you know, telling him he's got to get on the ship, he's got to be on the ship, and from the perspective of the person on one side of the conversation, what the captain was doing was completely irrational, but that person did not understand the situation, you know, at least in my interpretation, wasn't sensitive to the constraints that were salient to the captain and immediate to the captain. And so from the perspective of one side of the conversation, what the captain was doing was irrational. But if you step back and assess, you realize that, or again, my interpretation is that the captain was responding appropriately to the constraints that he was immersed within.
You touched upon something very powerful, John. I was going to ask you, why do you consider surprises as so important, and coping with surprises so important, as you described as the early part of your life journey for learning? And then you went into answering that question in such an eloquent way. I think you are absolutely right, John. I think the whole idea of human subjectivity, which is your and my world, can never be the same because of there's some very, very intense neurological studies done in this area by people like Antonio Damasio, one of the leading neuroscientists in the world. And it is so fascinating to see that we can never look at the world in the same way. And the myth and the beliefs that gave us meaning are never the same as the other person. And I think you're absolutely right when you talk about humility, because a large part of humility, I would say a large part, and I consciously use the word large, a large part of humility is actually trying to see the world from another person's perspective. And I know it's a very simple statement, a lot of people have made this, there's nothing new in it, but actually experiencing something of this kind is very unique, even in this very, very so-called modern scientific world. And I think as a researcher, especially if you have a researcher or you are a change agent in an organization where you have to understand things before because the golden rule of any change is to first understand where you are. I think it's hard for many people to see things from another person's point of view, almost impossible. And I've always struggled with this idea. And I think that has a lot to do with what you just touched upon, humility. Yes.
Yeah. So, an important influence on me in terms of how I see the world is Peirce's idea of abduction. And when he talks about abduction, so he talks about surprise, and that surprise creates a state of uncomfort. So when things don't conform to our expectations, our theories of the world, our hypotheses about the world, we get uncomfortable. And I think it's important to realize there's two ways of resolving that uncomfortable feeling. One is to retain your hypothesis and dismiss the observation as anomalous, or blame the captain. So but you attribute it to an anomalous or to something that's exceptional in the world, or you revise your hypothesis to better understand the world. And and I think it's just a natural. I don't think it's special, but I think if you live long enough, you experience enough anomalies that build up in a way enough so that you understand that all your hypotheses and all your beliefs about the world are guesses and tentative. And I think that's the key of abduction. And in contrast to the other logics, the formal logics assume there is something like an absolute truth. But the key difference between abduction and the others is abduction is always tentative. It's we're always guessing based on our experiences, but the only test of those guesses is pragmatic. It's in the consequences of acting on those hypotheses. And again, ideally the abductive system over time moves toward reducing surprises. But again, if you're humble, you reduce surprise by reconsidering your hypothesis and changing your views of the world. But if you're not humble, it's easy for you to dismiss the anomalies as exceptions to be ignored or to get past, and retain your, at all costs, retain your view as the truth.
Absolutely. Retain your view, retain your worldview, retain your homeostasis, which is all the governing of the life processes. It's biological, it's social,
and that's,
it's ego.
Yeah, and that I think that connects the idea of the term homeostasis. I think connects Damasio's work and Peirce's, in the sense that surprise is an emotional experience. It's discomfort, and that discomfort is, I think, is a psychological sign of instability, the psychological symptom of instability. And when we're uncomfortable, when we're experiencing discomfort, our energies are put toward resolving that discomfort. And again, we can do that by becoming more mindful of who we are and how we look at the world, or we can mindlessly, throw away observations as anomalies, or cast blame on, externalize.
It reminds me of a conversation with Gary Klein, actually, I had some time ago, where we were talking about the difference between experience and expertise. And he said 30 years of experience is just 30 years of experience. But 30 years of experience lived as a new day every day is 30 years of expertise. And I think that novelty and how you deal with novelty and surprises, it actually enriches the images in your world, which is basically the ability to cope with anything new. I think that's a fascinating thing to think about. And I think, John, there is a tension between how much more you want to be open to surprises, because on the one hand, you want to you confirm with the society and everyone else around you, so you can be a revolutionary and reach a completely different level in life through learning and open-mindedness, and I think that's quite possible. The trouble is that which group do you belong to then? Because you might find yourself completely out of sync with the rest of the world. And this is where I find that people who travel a lot and see the world through different sets of eyes, I travel a lot, sometimes have difficulties associating with any particular group, because they go so far away from what everyone considers as normal, even though they see things that other people don't. I think there is that innate sense to come back and belong to somewhere. And I think that always puts attention in how authentically can I live and declare my beliefs, and how much of that will be accepted in the world or the groups that I belong to. So I think there's always a tension between the two.
Yeah, well, to bring up another word, I think courage is important, because, again, on the long run, one way to protect your beliefs about the world is to make your world smaller. That is, retreat and to stay in familiar territories. And I think, relative to Gary Klein, is to do the same thing every day, and then you can get into a routine, and you can be, for example, as a musician, you can be an expert at one song if you only play one song over and over again for the whole life. Right. But you don't become a very skilled musician that way, an expert musician that way, and it takes courage to go in, to cross boundaries. Quite frankly, to be a human factors person and to go into other people's domain and interact with them and even try to help them takes a bit of courage, because you go in that domain and you're immediately an outsider, and the the thing that you're going to face in the beginning is a healthy skepticism on the part of the people. How is this guy going to come in here who's never flown an airplane and tell me something valuable that will help me learn to be a more effective pilot? Or how is this person who doesn't have any degrees in physics is going to help me understand and be more effective in a nuclear power plant? And so it's easy. It would be easy. In my career profession, it's easy for, and this gets back to Gary Klein too, it would be easy for a psychologist to retreat to the laboratory and spend their whole life studying puzzles and visual illusions and logical puzzles. And, you can find a puzzle that a lot of people get wrong, but that you can explain to why they're wrong and do 50 million permutations of that puzzle and get a publication from every permutation, but never learn anything about how experts perform and how ship captains make decisions and how emergency responders do what they do in the real world. So I think that's one of the things that Gary Klein demonstrates is the importance of your science going out into the world and getting outside the laboratory, which means that you're no longer in control of everything and all the stimuli and stuff. I think it reflects both curiosity, the desire to know that, but also the courage to take the risk of being wrong and being, facing the skepticism and being the outsider, being the new kid in a situation. And again, growing up, I didn't have any choice. I was dragged around by my father's career to different places and things, but I got the benefit of that experience and those exercises, and I think they have been useful to me throughout my career, those experiences.
Wonderful, John. I was just thinking about, as you were talking, that we started off with fallibility, and then we talked about kindness, and then we moved into humility, and then we talked about courage. And I want to now throw one more word into it, which I think you also talked about, by the way, you also talked about curiosity. But I think the other thing that I want to throw in is the whole idea of meaning, that we seek meaning in life. I think, and you're absolutely right, I think a lot of these things ultimately end up into whether this particular experience gives me meaning in life or not. And I think a lot of people today feel very vacant despite being in very powerful positions, earning a lot of money. Some do, having accumulated a lot of wealth and so on, but something is missing in life. And I think that's precisely what it is. I think when you find meaning in life, you feel a lot more satisfied in some ways. I think that quest for learning and meaning in life is one of the things that makes us human beings, seeking.
Yeah. And I think, and I think this is consistent with your interest in semiotics and stuff. But if I were to cast science, it's not the pursuit of truth, which I think is a fool's errand. It's the pursuit of meaning. And again, I like the word sense making. So I think meaning is not something that's fixed and absolute out there, but meaning is something that emerges, that meaning emerges from my experiences. So I think we have a role in, it's not just meaning's out there to be discovered, but meaning is constantly being created.
Yes, and I think the beauty of it is that if you look at one experience today and come back to it in a few weeks, months, or years, it'll give you a completely different meaning. And it has to, because if it doesn't, that means you haven't moved in your life much. I think that's a really good point, and a lot of learning is about movement and seeking new meanings in life. Yes, John, I'm just conscious of the time. Is there anything else you wanted to bring up about the book, or anything in general?
Well, just to capstone the idea of meaning, another book that's really influenced me is Persig's Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, and he I think the way he uses quality, I think, is analogous to meaning. Yeah, and and that I think one of the implications of his metaphysics of quality is that meaning is the raw material of perception, cognition, of his. It's not derivative, and that's the classical view, is that the world of physics and the descriptions of the physicists, which are designed specifically to take the observer out, that is to describe the world independent of the observers, is reality, and that our perceptions are derivative from that reality. And I think one of the implications of Persig's work, and something that I strongly believe in terms of my own metaphysics, is that meaning is the raw material for cognitive systems, and that the things of physics like length and size and those are derivatives from experience. Those are not the raw materials. We don't build meaning from the physical or the objective world of physics. We create physics from the world of meaning, the raw material of meaning in our lives as experience. But we experience the world as in terms of meaning, and not in terms of size or color as defined by the physicists.
No, and John, you touched upon something powerful once again. I met somebody in Australia. His name is Graham Long, and one of the powerful lessons from that little conversation was I actually read some of his books and I listened to his speeches. And I said, Graham, something you said has changed my life completely after listening to you. And he turned around to me in a very, very calm way and said, nobody changes anyone's life. Nobody does. No book can change your life. No quotation can change your life. It's what gives you meaning, and I could be saying 100 things, but I have no idea what you will take away from it. And I think that goes back to what you're saying, that it's very, very individual. It's very subjective. Even in writing that book, I have no idea what meaning you took away or others will take away from it. And it's fascinating to think along those lines. Yes.
Yeah. Well, one other theme that brings up, and again, in my reaction to your book, is the things that really, I think, that we do take away is not the algorithms or not the inferences, but the stories. And it's really your story and the story of the Costa Concordia that's what I'll take away from your book. And I actually, so just to balance out my praise, the method that you kind of introduced near the end, I kind of was a letdown for me. And it, as is any method, it's kind of reductive, and I'm always skeptical about it. But what impacted me, at a very deep level, were the stories, and that's one of the things. Again, to bring up Gary Klein again, is that's one of the powerful things of Gary Klein's work is he's an incredible storyteller, and
Yes.
and many of the things that I've come to learn kind of as a scientist and just as a person, I find huge validation in Gary's stories of my own intuitions about the world, and and I've known Gary for a long time personally. So he was in Dayton, I'm in Dayton, and so I consider him a friend and a colleague. But I think we're always we've come, we argue about the interpretations of his stories. So I take different things away from his stories than I think Gary even intends with his stories. But that doesn't reduce the fact that his work and his stories have had a huge impact in how I view the world.
Oh yeah, we are all meaning
Just
making.
as your stories have now.
Thank you. And someday we should talk about the method, because I think maybe there is a need to, it was the final chapter of the book. I didn't have the space to expand on it. But we should talk about the method. It's interesting you see it as reductive, because it's a semiotic method, and it's meant to generate abductive meanings. And it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on it once. We'll talk about that at some stage. It's anything but reductive, but we should discuss that in another discussion.
No, I mean, I understand the intentions behind it, but I think, to me, there's no recipes. No recipes
No, there
are
isn't.
right.
And that's the beauty of it, yes.
And that's, I think what you talk about, the I thou, that's the key. And it doesn't matter what method you use. If you go in with that attitude, you're going to walk away with something valuable.
And that's very powerful to have an ethic. But the most important thing is your disposition in life. And you could use any method; it doesn't really matter. But
right.
the point really is that I have firmly always believed that a methodology and a method should be very consistent with each other. If you don't have a method that flows along with the methodology, then you have a problem, because then it creates all sort of incoherence. It's a valid point, yes, but I think the most important thing is a methodology. Is what's your methodology? If you see another person as an object, you will never get to the richness of the story, no matter what method you use. It doesn't matter. And I think that's something we don't discuss, we don't articulate enough in risk and safety. What is your methodology? In human factors, we don't meditate on this issue. What is the methodology, and what do you believe in?
Well, see, that I wouldn't put it in those words. I mean, so I see the methodology as kind of a formalism, but to me, what's important, what I would say, is not the methodology, but the metaphysics. To use a big word, but in more common terms, I say it's the attitude you go into. And if your attitude is dominated by curiosity and respect, and you're going in there to listen and learn from the people you're observing, you get a lot more. It doesn't matter what technique. So I think about method as technique, but I think it's attitude you go in with that determines whether the technique is useful or not. And quite frankly, when I find myself, I often go in, I've been influenced by Gary Klein, and I've often tried to utilize his techniques, and I've often gone into interviews with the intention of using some of his techniques. But quite frankly, once I start engaging with a person, the techniques fall by the wayside, and I just get caught up in the stories and the relationship with the person, not with the technique. And so I just think that techniques are useful, but they're not, you have to hold them loosely. But your metaphysics, your attitude is, who you are in the I thou connection is the most important thing.
I think you said something very powerful there, which is metaphysics. And I always thought of, it's a very big word actually for the listeners, but I think you're absolutely right. What is the nature of existence? How do you see reality? And I think that's what I meant when I used the word methodology. You probably went one step ahead. And I think that's a wonderful word. One doesn't hear that word very often in outside of the research world. But I think just keeping that in mind is very powerful. Yes.
I associate methodology with techniques. not with larger beliefs, with
Yeah.
your more
But
global
but
beliefs,
John,
which
yeah, when we finish this podcast, I will send you an article that I recently wrote, and it's precisely on that topic. Why methodology matters, and uh, to me, methods, as you very rightly use the word, is technique, but a methodology is the deepest level of beliefs, as you said. How do you approach the world? How do you see the world? To
yeah,
me, that is your methodology. What is it that
yeah,
drives you to understand the world? And some people call it ontology, some people call it methodology, but that's, to me, is the same thing. How do you, and from the methodology, from the way you see the world, should flow the methods and techniques. And to be honest with you, if you come to that level of articulating your belief, which even doesn't happen in PhDs today. Yesterday was very interesting.
yes,
I was interviewed by a girl, and she is doing a PhD. And I asked her, what is your PhD about? And she is exploring differences between Aberdeen, which is where I live, and another city in Norway, to understand social inequalities. And I kept questioning her, why is all this important to you? And she kept responding back by seeing the problems in the outside world, i.e., income problems and poverty and everything else. But she could not make the connection between herself. Why is that issue important to her at a very existential level? I think if because we are all motivated by something, and if we are not able to articulate that enough, then it's very, very easy to get lost in the bushes as we go out to do the work. But once your methodology, once your ontology is articulated well to your own self, then everything else becomes, method doesn't matter.
yeah. No, I agree 100%, and I think that's one of the failures of scientific education today and engineering education is they're taught as a collection of techniques, and they're almost framed, science is framed in opposition to philosophy. That is, it's the idea of, philosophy is just endless debate, but science actually holds, we're empirical, and we actually have a method to resolve these philosophical debates, and so and again, I think this theme runs through your book is whether scientists are mindful or not, everything they do is based on a philosophy. They have an ontological view and they have an epistemological view about the world, and they either, in a sense, carry their cultural standards mindlessly and do what they do, or they're mindful about it, but there's nothing in most scientific training to help new scientists or student scientists to think about their philosophy and to think about their metaphysics that are shaping every their assumptions, and again, and it's almost to the point, for me, science is an extension of philosophy, and that it's built on the foundation of philosophy, but I feel like it's often taught and framed as in opposition to philosophy and as an alternative to philosophy.
Fascinating, because in Hinduism, which I never realized what my underlying belief until I finished this book, there's no real distinction between philosophy, religion, and science, or there wasn't. Philosophy and religion and science were seen as the same thing for years and years. It's only once you come to the Western science, you see a distinction between science and religion. Science says one thing and religion says another thing. And the other thing is the distinction between different philosophers. And this philosopher said this and that philosopher said that, which is very egocentric. Whereas if you go to the Hindu or the Indian philosophies, there is very little mention of who coined a philosophy. It's immaterial. What is important is what is the grand idea. And everything else is secondary. Everything else is subsumed by that. And I think, so in some ways, it's fascinating, because only after I wrote this book, everything surfaced and everything started to make sense. Why do I believe what I believe? And I think that question is rarely addressed in many books. that why do people believe what they believe, even and very often we are not able to articulate that. We struggle.
Well, and I think that's again one of the things that I take out of Persig's work. And by the way, I mean lots of people have read Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, but I think his second book, Lila, is even more important to help clarify what he intended in Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. But the point that he makes is that the split between science and religion means that science abdicates any sense of value. So science tells us what we can do, and it can explain global warming, but scientists doesn't tell us what we should do. They abandon responsibility for saying what's good to do. They leave that to the politicians and religion. But these things are intimately coupled, and that I think Persig uses the word quality to show that those two things are what we see is the quality of the world, and that it also resonates with Gibson's idea of affordances and stuff. We look at the world in terms of what we can do with it, what's good for, and what are the consequences, and those are reality. Those are part of understanding the experience, and to me, I think the basis of reality is experience, not not this objective independent world that exists independent from our experiences. The experience is the basis. So we don't, it's this dualism between subjective and objective that separates the should on the subjective side from the what can be done on the objective side, what's possible. But I think in life you can't separate those two things, and in reality I don't think you can separate those things.
Of course not. Of course not. And this whole idea of rule of law binds the society, as against some of the Eastern philosophies where it's not the rule of law, it's the morality that binds the society. Is such a contrasting way of looking at the world, because if you try to separate science from religion, where do people turn to when they want to do the right thing? Nature said God is dead. Okay, fine, but God is dead, but where do you turn to? So science is the modern religion now, and that's fascinating now.
But I think it's worse than that. I think the science has abandoned responsibility. So many scientists won't tell you what you should do. So I'm just going to give you the facts. I'm going to give you the data, but then you're left to your own, again, you're left to the church or the politicians to tell you what to do. The scientists say, well, I'm just deciding, I'm data.
Yes.
I got to be objective about this. And they think a value judgment is subjective and is not their responsibility. And I think that's, yeah.
I think that this.
It's like a doctor who doesn't take responsibility for his patients. I'm just give you the treatments, but
Well, this could be another discussion, John. I'm thinking, because what you're talking about it actually opens up a room for a completely different discussion, which is what, and I think it starts off from the whole idea of methodology, or what you call metaphysics. I think, how should we live life? What's the guiding principles of life? And I think that's a fascinating discussion in its own. I'm just conscious of the time, John, but how would you like to end this discussion?
Well, I would just say that I think the discussion has come full circle, and now we're talking about how scientists can be kind to the world.
Wow, isn't that nice? Yes, that's a wonderful way to bring it back. Yes. How can scientists be kind to the world? What is kindness? We talked a lot about. Yeah, I think that's a wonderful topic for discussion, for title for the podcast. Yes. Great.
Yeah. So, thanks you. I appreciate your time. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you. And if you hadn't reached out, I probably wouldn't have gotten your book. and I got a lot of value out of the book, so I learned a lot. So thank you very much.
Thank you, John. We should continue this conversation. I'd be interested to explore a little bit more in metaphysics with you, maybe in another podcast. We'll do something after the summer break, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, if you get a chance to look at our book, Meaning Processing, or What Matters, it was the title we used when we self-published it originally. But the first 3 or 4 chapters of that book are all my position in metaphysics and my ontology, my epistemology, and my semiotics. I kind of lay those out. So I would really be interested in your reaction to that, whether what I say makes sense to you.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Let's do that, John, and continue this discussion after the summer break.
Great.
Thank you, John.